Und um die Frage der Datenqualität und der Datennutzung wird es jetzt gehen. And I'm very happy to have a first international speaker here. It's Reka Solymosi, and she will share her thoughts and insights about the data-driven economy and what it means for lawyers and policymakers. And she's teaching at University of Manchester and Software Sustainability Institute she's a part of. So, very happy to have you here.
First, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me here, and also thank you for everyone to just abruptly, smoothly transitioning to English. I have to admit that in high school I was given a choice of 3 languages to learn between Spanish, German, and Russian, and I went with Spanish because of the weather. I'm sorry. Okay, so I slightly morphed my title, apologies, but I hope that the content is still relatively in line with what you were expecting to hear about. But before I go into it, I just wanted to say hello and who I am and possibly why I'm here. So that is me. My name is Reka, and as I said, or as was introduced, I'm a lecturer. So I'm a lecturer in quantitative methods based in the School of Law at the University of Manchester. So what does that mean? I am not a lawyer or a legal scholar. What I am is just a huge nerd about data. And so for some reason, the School of Law thought that it would be good to have someone like that on board. Particularly, I'm interested in new forms of data. And I've put new in quotation marks there because a lot of the data I work with are not actually new. They're just an alternative to things like surveys or focus groups that we traditionally use to learn about people's behavior and thoughts and spatial patterns and so on. But I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. So one of my favorite examples, does anyone use Strava? A couple of people. Okay, so it's this app for tracking your running, your cycling. It's meant to help you run faster or compete with your friends or just show off if you're really good at this. But what Strava also do, besides giving you this data back, is collect it for themselves. And they give it, they disseminate it back to users through this global heat map. So I like to go running when I visit somewhere, and I try to use this global heat map to see where local people, or just people in Berlin, I guess, like to go running, and I can use this to plan my running route accordingly. Another such platform is Flickr. Does anyone use Flickr? Flickr is this platform for uploading photos and sharing with your friends. So for example, my mom is really into birds. She takes lots of photos of birds and uses Flickr to share this with me and my brother. But the nice thing about Flickr is when you upload your photos, you are asked what is in this photo, and you're labeling this with a couple of keywords, which is used to index the photo, and these photos become searchable. So if I wanted to know what Berlin looked like before coming here, I just type in the word Berlin, and I have over 2.5 million photos from professional to absolutely everyone who's ever taken a photo and tagged it with Berlin at my disposal. So what can we do with this sort of data? Well, we can look into interesting questions using it. So this, for example, is a map of geo-tagged photos uploaded to Flickr, and it's color-coded whether it was uploaded by a local person or a tourist, someone who's not local to the area. And just by having a plot of this, we can start looking into spatial patterns of people's use of a city, right? So red here is tourists and blue is locals, and if you haven't guessed by now, that is Berlin. But what's really exciting about this is we can just start answering our questions with empirical data, right? So I don't know how many times you've come out of a movie theater and the person behind you says, oh, the book was so much better than the film. Well, now we can test that, right? So that's what the guys at 538 did. They had a look at the score of the book on Goodreads and the film adaptation on Metacritic, and we can see that in some cases, like Up in the Air over there, the book was pretty terrible, and it was the film that had a much better score. But I was told to, keep the brief around the topic of law, and also being based in the School of Law, I thought, okay, what are legal scholars doing with empirical research? And I had to dig, and I found this this project that I thought was very interesting. It's not using any of the techie type of data, but it's not using traditional survey data either, so I thought it was very interesting. So you might have heard that there's lots of controversy surrounding the cross-examination strategies of defense lawyers in the cases of rape in court, right? So when they're cross-examining the victim, some of the questions can be quite problematic, they can be traumatizing, and tap into things like the victim's sexual history or things like that. So in New Zealand in the 1970s, they brought some legislation into place to say, let's stop these kind of practices, let's give some guidelines of how to not ask questions like that. And what these people wanted to see is whether that had any sort of effect. So what they took is just court transcripts, right? So this is the write-up of what took place in court. And they took 21 historical transcripts, so before 70s, and then 21 current transcripts. And they went through and coded the cross-examination strategies of the defense lawyers across these possible categories that they could fall into. So for example, one of their categories was credibility. And within that, they had these topics. So they would ask about prior relationship with the defendant, or they would ask about the victim's sexual history, which don't necessarily pertain to the case, but they're painting this picture for the jury. And they counted instances when these types of cross-examination strategies occurred in historic and current cases, and summed it all up, and then eventually found that nothing has really changed. So this is interesting, right? Because legislation comes into place, we think that something might have changed, but actually data says no. When I got placed in School of Law, I thought, okay, there's some exciting people to collaborate with. And what I normally do, I'm very much a data-driven person. I'm just interested in methods. So I was browsing the web, and I came across this Consumer Data Research Center, which we have in the UK, who store all sorts of data about companies, consumers, people, demographics, and so on. At the same time, I was listening to a podcast. It's called Data Stories, by the way. If anyone's looking for data podcasts, I highly recommend it. And they had an episode about this method called Bayesian surprise maps, which was methodologically very interesting to me. It's a way to sort of debias thematic maps. I'll talk about it in a little bit. And I thought, this is exciting, here's some data I could apply it to, but I don't really know the domain, right? I need to speak to some colleagues here. And I have a colleague, she works in regulation law, so corporate law, and like financial regulation is her topic. She's not gonna be happy if I don't get this right. And she was interested in this companies in trouble concept. So the Consumer Data Research Center, they had this data set which is called county court judgments, which are instances when a company or an individual, but we're focusing on companies, is taken to court in order to pay a debt that they owe. And so my colleague said, this is great, this would be a really good indicator of companies in trouble because they're falling into debt, they're unable to pay it, they're being taken to court to pay it back. And I said, this is great, this is some data, I can map it. So just a little bit of data nerdiness in there to, put you to sleep in the morning. The reason that I thought this would be really exciting data to map is often when you map a thing, you are more like, and if you map a thing and the thing that it can happen to is not evenly distributed, you might just be mapping the thing that the thing can occur to. All the things were technical terms. So essentially what that means is that companies this is a map of England, companies are concentrated in London. Hopefully this isn't super surprising. So if we're talking about depth of companies, that is also concentrated in London. So one way to account for that in maps is to map the rate of something, right? So control for the number of companies in an area. So then you get a rate, so something like CCJs per 10,000 businesses. In this case, London still shows up, but London's weird, we'll talk about that in a second. But in this case, what can happen is areas with a really small number of the thing, so a low denominator, they can artificially inflate the rate, right? Because with smaller sample sizes, we get increase in variation. So the Bayesian surprise maps are a way of accounting for these and using an alternative approach. So this is what the surprise map of the CCJs look like, where we look at how surprising the results are compared to a prior belief of how we would expect CCJs to be distributed. So we thought this was some really cool finding. We found this north and south divide, and we took it to our specialist audience, and we said, hi guys, why do you think that there's this north-south divide in companies in trouble? And we got some comments, but the most interesting comments that we got were saying there's probably a difference in the extent to which people are willing to take companies to court, as well as the extent to which there is a difference in the debt. And so this was a really, really important problem. And my first sort of key point of caution for all you data users out there is that measurement is always an approximation. So we were using CCJs to approximate companies in trouble, but there are other factors that might influence these data. So I work a lot with crime data, and in crime data this is a well-known problem because if we use police-recorded crime as our indicator of crime, if we're measuring something like burglary or vehicle theft, we have very good data, right? Because if your car gets stolen, you report it to police, get a crime number, and then you can claim insurance. Whereas something like sexual harassment or hate crime, much less reported, right? It doesn't mean that it's happening less, but there's systematic biases in place that prevent people from reporting that in the same way that you report your car getting stolen. So I just included that blog link there because I share this with my students. It's got lots of good examples of cautions of why we're always approximating rather than exactly measuring. But I said I would talk about crowdsourced data, so I will. And this is kind of my bread and butter for research as well. So crowdsourcing, Flickr, and such were examples of individual people coming together to contribute to something. The key example I always uses Wikipedia. So how many people use Wikipedia for reading up on things? Okay, lots of hands. How many people have ever contributed to Wikipedia, to an article? Okay, this is abnormal, but I'm chalking it down to the bias sample in the crowd. But keep this in mind, at least it was a little bit fewer than people who have read. So the kind of crowdsourced data I work with mostly includes people complaining about things. So I look at this website called Fix My Street, which across the UK people can use to report something they don't like and need fixed in their neighborhood. And it's some very exciting data. I get to stare at pictures of garbage and read people complaining about street drinking and litter and rats and so on. But again, let's apply this to School of Law and what we're doing there. So there's a current project led by my colleague Graham Smith, and also as part of this legal tech course that we have with John Haskell, led by John Haskell, where we're trying to create this crowdsourced database of human rights complaints and issues with police accountability. So again, this will entail some platform where people can report these instances whenever they experience them. And it could be legal practitioners who are working on these kinds of cases, or it could be people who've experienced it or witnessed it, and so on. There's an example of a similar thing that exists. We're collaborating with this team in Chicago, which is the Citizens Police Data Project, where people report complaints against police, and then you have all sorts of follow-up data with that as well. So this is some really exciting stuff, right? Because this is a relatively rare event, we would like to think. And so collecting data with traditional methods doesn't result in a very good coverage, right? So getting people to report this as and when it happens to them, it leads us to collect over time this comprehensive sort of database. But I think you already knew what I was going to say, is that we have to be careful with these data, right? And I spoke about measurement being an approximation, but crowdsourced data has its own particularities. So this here is something called a Lorenz curve. It's used widely in economics to plot things like income inequality. So you'd get the top 1% earning 90% of income and so on. But this is for participation in Fix My Street, because that's where I have the data from. But essentially, as it's going up in this straight line here, it means as there's one person contributing, they contribute one report. One person, one report, all the way up to almost 80%. And then you can see that increases. Now the next people contribute 2 reports, and so on. And then you can see that sort of steep curve at the end. That means that top 1, 2, 3% of people contribute the majority of reports to Fix My Street. And this, you might have heard about this as the 1% rule of the internet. And these are some examples of the distribution of participation versus lurking and so on. But the reason I posed the Wikipedia question earlier, and why this room completely destroyed my point, so thank you Wikipedia contributors, is because I find that part really interesting. So Wikipedia, 99.8% of people who visit Wikipedia, they just consume content. 0.2%, they contribute occasionally, and it's 0.0003% who account for the majority of contribution to articles on Wikipedia, right? So you get this concentration on these very, very active people in generating crowdsourced data. And who these active people are is not evenly distributed either. So again, this is looking at the Fix My Street reports, but it's the number of reports in a neighborhood compared with a ranking, a deprivation score essentially for that neighborhood. And we see that in these areas where they score lower on deprivation, so they're better off areas, there's more reporting compared to the more deprived areas. And we see this across the board for all crowdsourcing projects, that the people who participate tend to be wealthier, they tend to be whiter, they tend to be higher educational attainment, and so on. And it's very much important to think about who does and who does not systematically participate in these sorts of projects if we're trying to collect this information. There are some very important ethical considerations, but I feel like that's an entirely different talk. But to do with crowdsourced data, I think it raises lots of questions around privacy, about ownership of data, data linkage. So often people put some sort of, so they would report something on Fix My Street, leave their name so the council can give them a reply, but you can use that name to link with other sorts of data, right? Which the people might not be thinking about. And the implications of the findings. So this service slanting essentially means if we have that top 1% of people shouting the loudest about problems in their neighborhood, and we use that data to target our resources to clean up that neighborhood, who are we really giving the voice to, right? Who are we focusing on? But I wanted to just leave you with the story of Abraham Wald. Is anyone familiar with this? Okay, a couple of people, very cool. So he's a Hungarian mathematician working in the US during World War II, and he was tasked with helping make the fighter planes more robust. So fighter planes obviously were getting shot holes into, and they wanted to reinforce it with some sort of shielding, but they can't cover the whole plane in that because it'll be too heavy and drop down, right? And so the planes were coming back, and the army people were looking at where all the holes were, and they're finding, you know what, it's a fuselage. All the holes in the plane are in the fuselage. This is where we need to put the more armoring over. In the fuselage, I think there were almost twice as many holes in there than around the engine, right? So they were like, definitely we need to protect the fuselage. So Wald came in and he said, that's probably not the answer. So is anyone starting to think what the answer might be? Okay, some nods. What if I told you that he is the person who's famous for survivorship bias? Yeah, a couple more people. Okay, we've got a participant answer. I don't think I can throw the mic to you, but I'll just wrap up very quickly. So the problem with this was that the planes with the holes over the engines were the ones that were not coming back. So we were examining all the planes that made it all the way back. It wasn't that people were miraculously missing shooting the engine. It was just that our data was biased. And I'm giving you credit for the answer. Anyway, thank you.